I received a short message that said, "Fly home. Don't say anything to your mother or brother." It arrived at 6:47 a.m. while I was sitting on a bright balcony in Hilton Head Island, watching my mother laugh harder than I had seen her laugh in over 20 years at something my brother had just said. The number was unknown. No name. Just 7 simple words that instantly made my stomach drop. 12 hours later, I was standing inside the arrivals area at Hartford Bradley Airport. A man in a gray suit held a sign with my name on it. 2 police officers stood beside him. They led me into a small conference room, and whatever they showed me in there caused my knees to give out. I don't remember falling. I only remember waking up under harsh ceiling lights while a paramedic calmly asked me to count backward from 10. That was 4 months ago, and I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. I need to share this because what my family did, and what I chose to do next, changed me in ways I never expected. If this story speaks to you, consider liking and subscribing, and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. My name is Willow Frau. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of how my own mother and brother tried to tear me down, and how the truth gave me the strength to stand again. Let me take you back to a cold, rainy night in Glastonbury, Connecticut, the night everything shifted. I was 11 years old. It was Tuesday, November 14th. I remember because I had brought home a permission slip for a field trip to the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford. All I needed was a signature and $3. That was it. My mother, Margaret Farrell, was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, holding the phone to her ear. Her voice was steady and distant. "It's done," she said. "She's leaving tonight." I didn't know who she was speaking to, and I still don't. She hung up and looked at me as if I were something in her way. "Pack your things," she said. I thought she meant for the trip, and for a moment I felt excited. Then she said, "You're leaving tonight." My brother Dean, who was 14, stood at the top of the stairs watching. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just leaned against the railing as if none of it involved him. My mother opened the front door. Rain pounded against the porch. She handed me a black trash bag and said, "Go. Don't come back." No suitcase. No coat. No explanation. Not even the $3 I needed for school. I walked 3 miles in that rain. My shoes were soaked before I reached the second block. The trash bag tore near Hebron Avenue, and my library book slipped into a puddle. I finally reached my grandfather's small house on Hubbard Street at 9:20 p.m. When he opened the door, he didn't ask questions or make phone calls. He knelt right there on the wet porch, wrapped his arms around me, and said softly, "You're home now, little bird." That was the last time anyone in my family hugged me for the next 21 years. My grandfather, Walter Ashford, was a retired civil engineer who lived simply and quietly. He had a small Cape Cod home, a vegetable garden, and a garage workshop where he repaired clocks and radios. He wore the same few flannel shirts every week and drank black coffee from a mug that said, "World's okay, Grandpa." He never had much, but he gave me everything that mattered: safety, patience, and a place to belong. That little house on Hubbard Street felt like a world of its own. My grandmother, Rosemary, filled it with warmth. She showed me how to cook Sunday pot roast, braided my hair before school, and read to me every night, even when I was 12 and probably too old for bedtime stories. I never asked her to stop. For 7 years, that home was the only place where I felt safe and wanted. During all that time, my mother never called. Not once. My brother didn't write. No birthday cards, no holiday visits, nothing. It was as if I had been quietly erased. My grandfather never pushed me to talk about it, but one afternoon when I was 13 and crying in the garage because a classmate had asked why my mom skipped a school meeting, he put down his wrench and said, "One day you'll understand why I'm saving the best for you. Not today, but someday." I didn't understand then. I just held on to the words. Every few months, a man in a gray suit would visit and sit with Grandpa behind closed doors. I'd hear their low voices, but never enough to make sense of it. When I asked, Grandpa would simply say it was an old friend helping with paperwork. I chose not to question it. I was just grateful to belong somewhere. When my grandmother passed away from a sudden stroke, the house grew quieter and heavier, but Grandpa stayed strong for me. He drove me to college visits, corrected my essays, and kept a locked oak box in his closet that he called Your Future. 3 weeks before I left for school, I found him peacefully gone in his chair, still in his flannel, a book resting in his hand. At his small funeral, neighbors and the local pastor came, and then my mother appeared, dressed in black, playing the grieving daughter. She never once met my eyes. My brother did. He leaned in and whispered that everything had been left to Mom and there was nothing for me. Afterward, a man in a gray suit approached me in the parking lot. He introduced himself as Thomas Mercer, my grandfather's attorney, and handed me a sealed envelope saying it wasn't time yet, but to keep his card. I carried both back to my dorm that night, too afraid to open them. I didn't know then that those two small pieces of paper would one day protect me. I worked my way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, studied computer science at UConn, and eventually moved to San Francisco with barely any money and a single suitcase. I worked exhausting hours at a startup, living in a tiny apartment and surviving on cheap meals. No one in my family knew where I was and no one cared to ask. But instead of anger, something else began to grow inside me. A quiet determination to build a life no one could take away. That I kept thinking about the students I met in college who had aged out of foster care with no support system at all. No family to guide them, no one to call when rent increased, when a car broke down, or when the silence in their apartment felt overwhelming. I understood that kind of isolation because I had lived through it myself. So at 27 I launched Heart Hein, a platform built to connect young adults leaving the system with volunteer mentors who would consistently show up. It wasn't about money or handouts. It was about reliability, about having someone who answers the phone and checks in. By 30, a venture capital firm invested, and the company was valued at $47 million. On paper I was financially secure, but inside I was still that girl who once walked miles in the rain carrying everything she owned. My closest friend, Grace Kimball, a nurse I met at the UConn library during freshman year, knew my entire history. She was honest to a fault and protective in her own way. Over dinner one night she warned me that if my family ever reached out, it would likely be because they wanted something, not because they had changed. I knew she was probably right, but part of me still held on to a small hope that things could be different. Later, while reviewing old college records, I noticed that part of my tuition had quietly been paid each semester by an anonymous education trust. There was no name attached, but deep down I suspected my grandfather had arranged it. Then one Wednesday night at 9:14 p.m., my phone lit up with a Connecticut number. I answered and my mother's voice filled the silence. She told me she had early-stage cancer, that she had been going to church, that she regretted the past. She apologized several times and asked if we could take a family trip to Hilton Head Island before it was too late. He said my brother wanted to apologize too. I refused at first, but after 3 restless nights arguing with myself, I agreed to go for 3 days on my own terms. She accepted immediately, which should have made me cautious. Shortly after, I received a text from an unknown number saying, "Be careful." I brushed it off and deleted it. When I arrived in Hilton Head in late September, the island was calm and beautiful, with warm air, quiet beaches and peaceful sunsets. It looked like the perfect place for a fresh start, and for a brief moment I let myself believe this trip might finally bring closure. I landed in Savannah and drove about 45 minutes to a luxury beachfront resort. Valet parking, orchids in the lobby, and prices that made you think twice before ordering juice. Dean had made the reservation and I didn't ask who paid for it. My mother was waiting in the lobby. She looked older and thinner, with silver strands at her temples and a soft blue cardigan that made her seem gentle and harmless. When she saw me, she opened her arms and began to cry before I even reached her, telling me how beautiful I looked and how much I reminded her of my grandmother. Dean stood just behind her, polished and confident, dressed neatly with a firm handshake like we were strangers at a work event. He introduced his girlfriend, Amber Jennings, who greeted me with an overly bright smile and said she had heard so much about me. That first dinner felt almost normal. My mother talked about church, Dean spoke about real estate deals, and Amber laughed at everything he said. No one mentioned the years of silence, but I noticed how often Dean asked about my job, whether I rented or owned, and if I was financially secure. I kept my answers general and changed the subject. Later that night, I received another text from the same unknown number asking if my brother had brought up money yet. This time I saved it. The next morning, my mother suggested beach photos to remember this reunion. I agreed, thinking it was harmless, but during the pictures she loudly told a nearby staff member that I had finally come back after years of running off. The story sounded neat and simple, completely untrue. I stayed quiet and forced a smile. Later, Dean's tone shifted. He admitted he'd had some financial setbacks and casually asked if I'd ever considered investing with him, as siblings should support each other. When I declined, he quickly mentioned that Grandpa had left everything to Mom and hinted there hadn't been much anyway. That night, I overheard them outside my door speaking in low, tense voices. My mother said I didn't know yet, and Dean replied that I seemed suspicious. I stood there frozen until the hallway went silent. Then I finally texted the unknown number asking who they were. The reply came minutes later. Someone your grandfather trusted. By the third morning, the final day I planned to stay, Dean walked into breakfast holding a manila folder, and I knew whatever they were planning was about to unfold. Dean placed the folder on the breakfast table like it was nothing important and said he had been reviewing Grandpa's estate. According to him, there were properties and accounts that hadn't been properly organized, and he thought it would be simpler if we all signed a new family trust agreement. When I read the document, I immediately noticed language that gave Dean full control over everything connected to the Ashford name. I may not be an attorney, but years of reviewing business contracts had taught me how to spot clauses that shift power quietly. I told him I needed time to review it carefully. He brushed it off as a simple formality and said Mom had already signed. When I repeated that I needed time, his expression changed. Back in my room, I photographed every page and sent them to my lawyer in San Francisco. 2 hours later, he called and told me clearly not to sign, explaining that the agreement would hand my brother control over assets I might not even know existed. While I was still processing that, the unknown number texted again, telling me to fly home on the 6 a.m. flight from Savannah and promising a car would be waiting in Hartford. I sat there torn, questioning whether I could trust an anonymous message over my own family, but then I reminded myself of the history I couldn't ignore. Before dawn, I quietly packed my carry-on, took the service stairs, and left without saying a word. During the drive to the airport, I realized I never truly unpack in places where I don't feel safe. At the gate, I felt tense but certain I was making the right choice. After the plane took off, my phone filled with messages from Dean and my mother. First concern, then guilt, then urgency about the trust. The pattern was familiar. I powered off my phone and leaned back in my seat, trying to steady myself. That's when I felt something inside my jacket pocket I hadn't noticed before. A small reminder that this situation was far from over and that I needed to stay alert. Inside my jacket pocket was an old business card, the edges worn and soft from being carried for years. Thomas Mercer, attorney at law. I had kept it in my wallet for 14 years, moving it from one jacket to another without ever knowing why I couldn't throw it away. Now I understood. When I walked into Hartford Bradley Airport, a man in a gray suit with silver hair stood near the arrivals area holding a small sign with my name. 2 Connecticut State Police officers stood nearby, calm but clearly there for a reason. The man lowered the sign and introduced himself as Thomas Mercer, my grandfather Walter Ashford's attorney. His handshake was steady, his voice direct. He asked me to follow him to a private conference room. Inside, he carefully laid out 3 items on the table: a bound legal document, a sealed cream envelope with my grandmother Rosemary's handwriting, and a thick folder filled with organized tabs. He explained that my grandfather had drafted a will in 2012 naming me as the sole beneficiary of his entire estate, including the house on Hubbard Street, long-term investments, and savings accounts accumulated over decades. The estimated value was $2.8 million. I felt the room spin. Thomas said my grandfather had given 2 specific instructions. The will was to be executed only after I turned 32 and only if my family reconnected with me. He believed they would return once they discovered the money. Then Thomas opened the folder and explained why the police were present. Spread across the table were printed screenshots of messages between Dean and a man named Victor. In the texts, Dean discussed backup plans if I refused to sign the trust documents. A private investigator named Rachel Dunn, whom Thomas had hired the day my mother contacted me, calmly explained that Dean owed $340,000 in gambling debts. She showed evidence that he had broken into Grandpa's old house months earlier, found a draft of the will, and worked with my mother to plan the reunion trip. Their goal had been to pressure me into signing over control of the estate. But if that failed, the messages suggested something far worse. One text described making my death look like an accident at the resort. I read the words several times, hoping I had misunderstood, but I hadn't. Rachel looked at me steadily and confirmed that the threat was real. Then she slid one final message across the table, Dean writing directly to my mother. And in that moment, everything I had feared became undeniable. The final message was dated 2 days before the trip. Dean wrote, "She's not signing. We may need the backup plan. My mother replied, do what you have to do. Just keep me out of it. 8 words. No hesitation. I excused myself and walked to the restroom down the hall, locked the door and broke down in a way I hadn't since I was 11 years old. My whole body shook as I cried under the harsh fluorescent lights. When I returned to the conference room, my eyes were swollen but my mind was clear. I asked Thomas what happened next. He calmly outlined the legal steps, protective orders and coordination with law enforcement, but before he could finish I felt dizzy and collapsed. A paramedic helped me, checked my pulse and told me my blood pressure had dropped. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I thought about my grandfather kneeling on that rainy porch years ago, taking me in without questions. He had seen the truth about my family long before I did and had quietly prepared for it. Once I steadied myself, I told Thomas the first didn't want revenge. I wanted everything brought into the open. He nodded and placed the sealed envelope from my grandmother in front of me, the same one he had given me years earlier. I had carried it across cities and stages of my life without opening it. He reminded me she had written it just before she passed. I slipped it into my bag for later. That night, Thomas arranged a safe hotel in Hartford and Grace flew in from Boston. She hugged me tightly and reminded me she had warned me, but she also understood why I had gone. Meanwhile, police coordinated quietly between states. The plan was to detain Victor first, then take Dean into custody the next morning. Near midnight, unable to sleep, I finally opened my grandmother's letter. The wax seal cracked softly and inside was a pale yellow page and a photograph. Her handwriting was steady and thoughtful, and as I held it, I realized the truth had been waiting for me all along. The letter began, "My dearest Willow, if you're reading this, your grandfather and I are both gone, and someone is trying to take what belongs to you. I'm sorry I couldn't shield you while I was alive, but please understand, you were never the problem. Your mother carried her own wounds long before you were born, and instead of healing, she passed that pain on. You deserve a full and happy life, little bird. Build your own nest. Love, Grandma R." Tucked inside was a photo of me at 5 years old sitting on her lap, both of us laughing, and on the back she had written in pencil, "You are always enough." Grace found me on the floor holding that photo, tears running quietly down my face, and she simply sat beside me and held my hand. Shortly after, Thomas texted to say Victor had been arrested and was cooperating, and that Dean would be taken into custody in the morning. At 7 sharp, officers arrived at my mother's house in Glastonbury and arrested Dean while he sat at the kitchen table. Rachel later sent a brief, factual update confirming everything. My mother called soon after, panicked and accusing me of ruining her son's life. I told her the police had the messages, including hers. When she tried to explain it away, I ended the call. In the following days, Dean was held without bail, Amber disappeared without a trace, and my mother quickly hired a lawyer to challenge my grandfather's will, claiming he hadn't been of sound mind. At the same time, she posted online portraying herself as a victim, and soon strangers began calling me with accusations based on her version of events. I ignored them until a former neighbor, Patricia Boyd, reached out. She told me that on the night I was forced out at 11, she had called the police after seeing me walking alone in the rain with a garbage bag. My mother had told the responding officer that I left willingly to stay with relatives, and the report was quietly closed. I had never known any of this. Mrs. Boyd apologized for not questioning it further. Thomas later confirmed that my grandfather had kept a copy of that police report and had even tried several times to gain custody of me, but my mother threatened legal action against him if he pushed harder. Instead, he protected me quietly in the only ways he could, by preparing for a day when the truth would finally come to light. My grandfather had tried to protect me, but my mother used lies like a weapon to keep him away. I chose not to argue on social media or answer every accusation from family friends. I didn't post public defenses or try to convince people who already believed my mother's story. Instead, I followed what my grandfather had always taught me: focus on building something meaningful rather than fighting every attack. Thomas submitted the official petition to confirm the will in Hartford Probate Court, and a hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. My mother's lawyer argued that my grandfather was mentally unfit when he signed the will, but Thomas said such claims usually fail when a recent psychiatric evaluation proves competence. Grandpa had one conducted by Dr. Alan Fielding, a licensed psychiatrist in New Haven, confirming he was fully capable of making decisions. Thomas later brought me a wooden oak box with a brass latch, the same box my grandfather kept hidden in his closet. He said my grandfather left instructions that it should be given to me when the legal process started. Inside were 7 leather-bound notebooks filled with my grandfather's handwriting, recording 7 years of his life from the time I moved in with him until his death. The journals documented every phone call with my mother, every rejection, every attempt to protect me, and every quiet effort he made to secure my future. He had been preparing for this fight long before I knew it would happen. I contacted Mrs. Boyd and asked if she would testify about the night she saw me walking in the rain after my mother forced me out. She agreed immediately, saying she regretted staying silent for so long. Meanwhile, Grace helped me find a non-profit program that supports young adults transitioning into stable housing. My grandfather's empty house on Hubbard Street carried a simple but powerful note in the will, written in the margin, saying it was meant for children who needed a safe door to open. I began realizing that he had not only protected me but also built a path for my future, even though he never lived to personally hand me the key. 3 days before the hearing, Dean's lawyer offered a plea deal that would reduce the charge if I agreed not to pursue civil damages. I told Thomas the first wasn't interested in money,